The movie Goodfellas is based on a true story. A real job, a real crew, and real people. But the film you saw is the cleaned-up version. The truth is far worse. The mob we think we know comes from the movies. Sharp suits, clever one-liners, dangerous men who still somehow live by a code. Loyalty, respect, honor. That picture is comforting, and it is almost entirely a lie. The real stories are darker than anything Hollywood was willing to show you. Across this video, I am going to walk you through 10 true cases, and they get worse as we go. We will start with the actual events behind Goodfellas, the part the film left out. We will move through corrupt agents, hidden crews that made people vanish, and bosses taken down in the open. And we will end with a crime so cruel that it shattered the myth of Mafia honor for good. Section 1. The real job behind the movie before Goodfellas was a film. It was a true story. And the true story is darker than anything Martin Scorsese put on the screen. It is December 11th, 1978. New York is cold and silent in the early morning. At John F. Kennedy Airport, the German airline Lufthansa runs a cargo building where valuable shipments come and go. Most people walking past would never guess what sits inside, but a small group of men tied to one of New York's mob families knew exactly what was in that vault, and they had been planning to take it for months. The whole thing started with a tip. A cargo worker at Lufthansa named Louis Werner knew a secret about the airline. Roughly once a month, Lufthansa flew in large amounts of cash from Germany, money that American soldiers and tourists had exchanged overseas. That cash often sat overnight in the vault before being sent off to banks. Werner owed a lot of money to a bookie named Martin Krugman, and he let it slip that the vault was full of cash that could never be traced, plus a fortune in jewels. Krugman passed the tip to a man named Jimmy Burke, who was tied to the Luces family. People called him Jimmy the Gent. Burke was not a full member of the family, because he was of Irish background, and the rules of that world only let Italians take that final step. But everyone respected him, and plenty of people feared him. He owned a bar in Queens called Robert's Lounge, and that bar is where the plan came together. The place was more than a hangout. It was where deals got made, and where a job like this one could be talked through out loud without much worry. A Luces captain named Paul Vario gave it the green light. Burke picked his crew. He had inside maps, the names of the workers who would be on shift, and the exact timing. Almost nothing was left to chance. In the early hours of that December morning, the crew cut through the airport fence and walked into the cargo building wearing masks. They gathered the workers, kept everyone calm, and loaded the haul into a waiting van. Nobody got hurt. No alarm reached anyone in time. The whole thing was finished in about an hour. When they drove off, they had around $5 million in cash and close to $1 million in jewels. At the time, it was the biggest cash grab in American history. The crew had been promised cuts of somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000 each, based on a guess that the take would land around $2 million. The real haul was nearly triple that. All at once, there was far more money on the table than anyone had planned for, and far more reason for things to go wrong. On paper, it looked like the perfect job. The money could not be traced. The planning was tight. The crew had slipped back into the city before sunrise. If the story stopped there, it would simply be a clever job that nobody ever cracked. That is not how it stopped. Here, the real story turns into something the movie only hinted at. Jimmy Burke had a problem. Too many people knew about the job, and a secret shared by that many people is a hard thing to keep. Burke chose to fix it in the simplest way he understood. One by one, the people connected to the job began to disappear. The first slip came quickly. The man who was supposed to get rid of the getaway van left it parked on a street instead. Police found it, and that one mistake put everyone at risk. After that, the people who had touched the job started turning up gone. A few were found in their cars. One was found frozen in the back of a meat truck. Money that should have set these men up for life got them removed instead. Over the months and years that followed, around a dozen people linked to the job were either found gone or simply never seen again. Almost none of the money was ever recovered. And in a strange twist, only one person ever served time for the whole thing: Louis Werner, the cargo worker who started it all with a single tip. This is the story Goodfellas is built on. The film follows Henry Hill, a real man who lived inside this world and later turned against it. When Hill sensed he might be next on Burke's list, he went to the authorities and told them everything he knew. His account became a book, and the book became the movie. But films have to stay watchable. They trim the edges. They turn a long, ugly cleanup into a handful of quick scenes set to music. The real version was slower and colder. It was not one wild night and a few bad breaks. It was a careful operation followed by months of quietly erasing anyone who could talk. Burke was picked up by police in 1980 over a separate matter, was later found responsible for ending another man's life, and spent the rest of his days behind bars, passing away in 1996. Polvario also spent his final years locked up. The men who pulled off the biggest score of their lives mostly never got to spend a single dollar of... Strangely, the case never truly closed. As late as 2015, a man named Vincent Asaro went on trial for his alleged part in the job, and a jury found him not guilty. More than 35 years later, the biggest cash grab in the country's history still had no clean ending. So a job this careful still came apart within months. That raises a simple question the movie never really answers. What would it take to make people vanish so completely that no one could ever trace them again? Across that same city, another crew was already perfecting an answer, and it was far more disturbing than anything that happened at the airport. Section 2. The crew that made people disappear, the Lufthansa job, fell apart because Jimmy Burke had to clean up after himself. And cleaning up is messy. People who were dealt with still turned up. Cars still got traced. Around the same time, in another part of New York, a man named Roy DeMeo was solving that exact problem in a way that still unsettles the people who later looked into it. DeMeo grew up in Brooklyn and started small, the way many of these men did. He ran money on the streets and lent it out at high interest. He was good at it, and he was willing to do things other people would not. That caught the eye of a man named Nino Gaggi, who was connected to the Gambino family, one of the biggest mob families in the city. Gaggi brought DeMeo in, and over time DeMeo built his own crew. They began by dealing in cars that were not their own and moving product around the city. Then they moved into something far worse. What set DeMeo apart was not how many people he went after. It was how careful he was about it. He had once worked as a butcher's helper, and he took the skills from that job and turned them towards something dark. He set up shop in a small bar in Brooklyn called the Gemini Lounge, and in an apartment right next to it, he built a system. The whole point of the system was simple and chilling. When someone was marked, they were brought to that back room, dealt with quickly and quietly, and then made to vanish in a way that left nothing for anyone to find later. That last part is what made the crew so dangerous. With most cases, there is something left behind. A person who is missing, something that points back to who did it. DeMeo's crew worked hard to make sure none of that existed. No trace, no proof. Often, not even a missing person report that led anywhere. People simply stopped showing up, and there was no way to prove what had happened or who was behind it. To the outside world, DeMeo looked respectable. He ran a used car business and lived as a family man in the suburbs, the kind of neighbor nobody would ever suspect. That double life was a big part of why he stayed free for so long. Because of all this, no one is fully sure how many people the crew went after. The estimates run wide. Some investigators believe the number was around 25. Others have put it as high as 100, even 200. The honest answer is that nobody can say for certain, and that uncertainty is the whole horror of it. A crew this careful does not leave behind a clean count. Those big numbers deserve a note of caution because they are estimates, not proven facts. What investigators could actually prove later was a much shorter list. But even the cases they could prove were enough to shock people who had spent their whole careers around this world. The crew ran on a tight inner circle. Two of DeMeo's closest men were so often side by side that people started to treat him like a matching pair. The apartment next to the bar belonged to another member who handled the worst of the work. They were not loud men chasing fame. They were quiet, organized, and treated the whole thing like a business with a schedule and a process. That is the part that lands hardest. The Lufthansa crew were men who got greedy and panicked. DeMeo's crew were something colder, people who had turned the worst thing a person can do into a routine. For a while, that cold efficiency made DeMeo valuable. The Gambino family used his crew, and the boss of the family, Paul Castellano, eventually gave DeMeo full membership. But the same thing that made DeMeo useful also made him a problem. The more people who disappeared around him, the more attention he pulled in. Police were circling. Investigators were starting to connect names. In that world, a man who brings heat down on everyone above him does not last. The breakthrough for investigators eventually came the way it almost always does in these stories, from the inside. A member of the crew agreed to talk, and once one person starts telling the truth, the wall of silence that protects the rest begins to crack. But DeMeo did not live to see most of that. In January 1983, his own people turned on him. He was found in the trunk of his car, taken out by the very crew and family he had served. The man who had spent years making sure others were never found ended up left in plain sight as a message. Many believe the order came straight from the top of the family, from the same boss who had once welcomed him in. DeMeo's story shows something the movie version of the mob rarely admits. The scariest people in that world were not the wild ones who caused scenes in public and made the news. They were the calm and careful ones who treated terrible acts like simple paperwork. Goodfellas gives you panic and chaos and bad choices. The DeMeo crew was the opposite: patient, professional, and almost impossible to catch. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the man at the top, the boss who's likely signed off on ending DeMeo, was not nearly as safe as he believed. Less than 3 years later, that same boss would step out of a car on a busy city street to go get dinner. What happened in the next few seconds would shock the entire country and change the mob forever. Section 3. The boss taken down in the open at the end of the last story. A powerful boss likely gave the order to get rid of Roy DeMeo. That boss was Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino family, the most powerful mob family in the country at the time. He believed he was untouchable. Within a few years, he would learn how wrong he was in front of a street full of holiday shoppers. Castellano was not a typical mob boss. Most of the men in that world built their power on fear and force on the street. Castellano built his on business. He came up through construction, trucking, and the meat trade, and he ran the family like a company. He wore nice suits, kept his own hands clean, and surrounded himself with the look of a respectable businessman. To him, the loud, hands-on style of the old days was bad for profit. That attitude made him a lot of money, but it also made him enemies inside his own family. Men who felt he had forgotten where he came from and looked down on the soldiers who did the hard, ugly work. One of those men was John Gotti. Gotti was ambitious, hungry, and from a rougher corner of the family. He had a mentor near the top named Aniello Della Croce, a respected figure who acted as a kind of buffer between the street guys and Castellano. As long as Della Croce was alive, things held together. But in early December 1985, Delacroix passed away from illness. With him gone, the peace went too. Making it worse, Castellano did not show up to pay his respects at the wake, and that insult lit a fire under the men who already resented him. Gotti decided to make his move. Taking out a boss was the most serious act in that entire world, and the rules said you needed permission from the ruling council that sat above all, the families. Gotti did not have that permission. He went ahead anyway. That choice, more than anything else, is what made this so shocking to the people inside the life. He was not just removing a man. He was breaking the oldest rule there was. On December 16, 1985, Castellano had a dinner planned at Spark Steakhouse on East 46th Street in the middle of Manhattan. It was around 5 in the evening, right in the heart of the Christmas shopping season, with crowds and traffic everywhere. A team of men dressed in matching trench coats and fur hats was already in place near the entrance. The outfits were not a coincidence. They were a kind of uniform, meant to make the men blend together and confuse any witnesses about who was who. Castellano arrived in a car driven by his right-hand man, Thomas Bilotti. As the car pulled up and Castellano stepped out toward the restaurant, the waiting team moved in. It was over in a matter of seconds. Both Castellano and Bilotti were taken out right there on the sidewalk, in plain view of anyone passing by. The men in trench coats walked off into the crowd and were gone. John Gotti watched the whole thing from a car parked nearby, sitting beside another man named Sammy Gravano. To be sure the job was done, Gotti had the car drive slowly past the scene before they left. He saw what he needed to see. 2 weeks later, John Gotti was the new boss of the Gambino family. For a while, it looked like he had pulled off the impossible. Gotti became famous, almost a celebrity. The newspapers loved him. He dressed sharp, smiled for the cameras, and kept beating court cases, which earned him a nickname that stuck: the Teflon Don, because the charges never seemed to hold. But the other families were furious. Taking out a boss without permission was the kind of thing that demanded an answer. A few months later, an explosion meant for Gotti instead ended the life of his new second-in-command, a man named Frank DeCicco. It was payback for breaking the rules, and a clear warning that Gotti had made powerful enemies who were not going to let it slide. The case that finally caught up with Gotti came in the early 1990s. The key to it was the same man who had sat next to him in that car, watching Castellano go down. Sammy Gravano had been Gotti's underboss and trusted partner. When the pressure climbed high enough, Gravano turned and agreed to work with the government. In court, he laid out exactly how the Sparskis job had been planned and carried out, with Gotti giving the orders. That testimony, along with secret recordings the government had been gathering for years, was enough. In 1992, Gotti was found guilty and sent away for life, with no chance of release. He passed away behind bars years later. The reason this moment mattered so much comes down to how it was done. In the movies, a job is carried out in a quiet alley or a parked car, away from prying eyes. The Castellano takedown was the opposite. It was loud, public, and almost theatrical, pulled off in one of the busiest parts of one of the busiest cities on Earth during the holidays, with regular people walking past. It was a message as much as it was an act. It said the old rules were finished, and a new, more reckless kind of boss was in charge. And it proved that in this world, not even the man at the very top was safe. Least of all from the people closest to him. But while Gotti was busy becoming a household name, a far quieter story had already played out inside another family. The most dangerous person the mob ever let through the door did not want power, money, or fame. He wanted information. And for years, not a single person around him had any idea who he really was. Section 4. The stranger they trusted. Everything you have heard about so far happened between criminals. This story is different. This is about a man who walked into that world on purpose, lived inside it for years, earned the trust of dangerous people, and the whole time was quietly working for the other side. His real name was Joseph Pistone. He was an agent with the FBI. But to the men in the mob, he was Donnie Brasco, a small-time jewel thief who seemed to know the right people and carry himself the right way. Pistone had grown up around Italian neighborhoods and understood how that world talked and moved. That background, plus a calm nerve that most people simply do not have, made him the perfect person for a job nobody had ever truly pulled off before. In 1976, the FBI sent Pistone undercover. The plan was supposed to last about 6 months. It ended up lasting close to 5 years. At first, his focus was small, keeping an eye on stolen goods moving off trucks around New York. But Donnie Brasco was good at his cover, almost too good. He kept getting pulled deeper, and soon he was rubbing shoulders with members of the Bonanno family, one of the 5 big mob families in the city. The man who took Donnie under his wing was a longtime soldier named Benjamin Ruggiero, who everyone called Lefty. Lefty taught Donnie the rules, vouched for him, and treated him almost like a son. Later, Donnie also got close to a captain named Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black. These were not foolish men. They had survived for decades in a world where one wrong read of a person could cost you everything. And they let Donnie Brasco all the way in. They trusted him completely. They had no idea he was writing it all down for the government. Living that double life cost Pistone more than people realize. For years, he could not be a normal husband or father. He missed birthdays and holidays and school events. His own family barely saw him, and his marriage strained under the weight of it. He spent his days around people who would end his life in a heartbeat if they ever learned the truth. And he had to keep that mask on every single moment, with no real breaks and nobody nearby to lean on. While Pistone was inside, the Bonanno family began to tear itself apart. In 1979, the head of the family, Carmine Galante, was taken out. That set off a power struggle over who would run things. In 1981, the fighting reached a peak when 3 high-ranking captains were done away with on a single day as one side moved to remove the other side entirely. Donnie Brasco was close enough to all of this to see how it really worked, which is exactly what the FBI had hoped for. Then came the moment that ended the operation. The family wanted to make Donnie a full, official member. It was a huge honor, and it would have given the FBI an agent at the very heart of the mob. But there was a catch. To earn that rank, Donnie was expected to take part in ending someone's life. That was a line Pistone could not cross, and the FBI would not let him. In the summer of 1981, with too many people around him losing their lives and the danger climbing by the day, the FBI made the call to pull him out. When the agents finally walked up to the mobsters and revealed that Donnie Brasco had been one of their own all along, the news landed like a thunderclap. These men had trusted him with secrets, with money, with their lives. Lefty, the one who had treated Donnie like family, was said to be stunned, admitting that he had truly cared about the younger man. There was no anger that could match that kind of betrayal, because in their world, being fooled this badly was almost worse than any loss. What Pistone walked out with was staggering. The information he gathered led to more than 100 members of the mob being convicted and sent away. It also changed how the FBI fought organized crime forever, proving that a patient agent on the inside could do more damage than any raid or stakeout. The bosses were so embarrassed that they punished the entire Bonanno family, treating them like a joke for letting an outsider get that close. There was a heavy price for the people who had let Donnie in. Sonny Black, the captain who had welcomed him deeper into the family, was blamed for the disaster. His own people turned on him, and he paid for that trust with his life. Lefty was picked up by the FBI before the same thing could happen to him, and the mob was so desperate for payback against Pistone himself that the leaders put a price on his head. $500,000 to anyone who could find him and take him out. Pistone and his family had to live carefully for a very long time because of it. The reason this story belongs here is simple. The mob was built on trust, loyalty, and reading people correctly. That was their whole survival system. And one quiet man with a fake name walked through all of it and brought the whole thing crashing down without ever harming a soul. No movie villain did more damage to those families than a polite stranger they invited to dinner. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Donnie Brasco was the FBI at its absolute best, an honest agent risking everything and playing by the rules to win. In another city, a very different agent was about to show the opposite. He would cross over to the criminal side completely, and the result would be a betrayal far darker than anything the mob ever pulled off on its own. Section 5. When the law crossed over, Donnie Brasco showed what the FBI could do when an agent did everything right. This next story shows what happened when an agent did everything wrong. And it may be the darkest thing in this entire list because the danger did not come from the mob. It came from the people who were supposed to stop it. The setting is Boston, not New York. The man at the center is James Bulger, better known by a nickname he hated, Whitey. Bulger ran a tough crew called the Winter Hill Gang out of South Boston. He was not part of the Italian Mafia. His gang was mostly Irish, and they made their money through fear, gambling, moving product, and squeezing payments out of anyone who did business on their turf. By any honest measure, Bulger was one of the most dangerous men in the city. One thing made his story different from every other gangster's. For most of his rise, Bulger had a secret partner inside the law. His name was John Connolly, and he was an agent with the FBI. The two men had a connection that went back to childhood. Connolly grew up in the same South Boston housing project as the Bulger family and knew Whitey's younger brother well. That younger brother, by the way, grew up to become one of the most powerful politicians in the state. The neighborhood ties ran deep. In the mid-1970s, Connolly made Bulger an offer. If Bulger would feed the FBI information about their biggest target, the Italian Mafia, then Connolly would look out for him. The Bureau in Boston was obsessed with bringing down the local Italian crime family and their allies. Bulger knew plenty about those rivals, and he was happy to hand them over. In return, he expected protection. That is exactly what he got. For years, Connolly treated Bulger less like a source and more like a friend he had to keep safe. When investigations started pointing at Bulger, Connolly tipped him off. When other agencies got close, Bulger somehow always knew to step back. Connolly even helped keep Bulger out of a major case that put away other members of his own gang. With a federal agent quietly clearing his path, Bulger was able to build his operation and grow more powerful, while the people around him went away and he walked free. The information did work from the FBI's narrow point of view. Connolly used Bulger's tips to take down the head of Boston's Italian Mafia and weaken the larger crime family in the region. To the Bureau, Connolly looked like a star, the agent with the golden source who always got results. What his bosses chose not to look at too closely was the price of those results, that they were shielding a man responsible for many people losing their lives in order to get them. And that is the part that turns this from a sad story into a true scandal. It was not only one bent agent. Connolly pulled at least one of his supervisors into the mess, a man who also covered for the arrangement. Over time, it became clear that people higher up had reason to know something was deeply wrong and chose to keep the relationship going anyway, because Bulger was too useful to give up. The people he harmed were treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. The whole thing finally cracked in the 1990s. By then, Connolly had retired, but his old habits did not stop. In late 1994, he tipped Bulger off one more time, warning him that the government was about to come for him. Bulger took the warning and vanished. He stayed gone for 16 years and climbed high on the FBI's most wanted list. He was finally found in 2011, living quietly in California with his longtime girlfriend and more than $800,000 in cash hidden inside the walls of their apartment. In 2013, Bulger stood trial at last. He was found responsible in connection with 11 deaths, along with a long list of other serious crimes committed while he was supposedly helping the FBI. The man who had spent decades as a protected informant was finally held to account, though far too late for the families who had lost people along the way. Connolly fell even harder, and his fall made history. He was convicted of corruption and of blocking justice. Then, in a separate case, he was found responsible for his part in the death of a man named John Callahan. That made him something almost unheard of. An FBI agent convicted in connection with a killing carried out to protect a criminal source. He was sentenced to 40 years. As for Bulger, his end was as harsh as his life. In 2018, at 89 years old and in a wheelchair, he was moved to a prison in West Virginia. Within hours of arriving, he was attacked by other inmates and did not survive. Men connected to the very Italian Mafia he had spent his life informing on were suspected in it. The reason this story matters more than almost any mob tale is the betrayal at the heart of it. People expect criminals to lie and harm and protect their own. That is the deal you make when you enter that world. But here, the line between the law and the lawless did not just blur, it vanished. An agent sworn to protect the public spent years shielding a predator instead, and a powerful institution let it happen. The mob was frightening. A government that quietly works with the mob is something worse. To see how far back this dark game of informants and silenced witnesses really goes, we have to leave the modern era behind. We have to travel to the 1930s, when the crime families first built a machine whose only purpose was ending lives on command, and to one witness whose final moments have never been fully explained. Section 6. The company that did it for a paycheck. Everything so far has taken place from the 1970s onward. To find where this all started, we have to go back further, to the 1930s, when the crime families built something that had never existed before. An actual business whose only product was harm. In that era, the different mob groups across the country worked together more than people realize. They formed a loose network, and that network needed a way to handle problems. When a boss somewhere wanted a rival, a witness, or a troublemaker dealt with, he did not want it traced back to him. So the family set up a separate outfit to do that work for them, based out of a corner of Brooklyn called Brownsville. The newspapers later gave it a grim nickname, Murder Incorporated. What made this operation so chilling was how ordinary it was treated. The men who worked for it were not acting out of anger or revenge. They had no personal reason to harm the people they were sent after. To them, it was simply a job. A request would come in from a boss in another city, the target would be looked into, and a team would be sent to take care of it. The men got paid for each assignment, the way a worker gets paid for a shift. There was a system, a chain of command, even a kind of payroll. They turned the worst thing a person can do into a routine line of work. Two powerful figures sat at the top of it. One was a feared boss named Louis Buchalter, better known as Lepke, who at one point was the most wanted man in the country. The other was Albert Anastasia, a man so comfortable with this line of work that he earned nicknames built around it. Under them worked a stable of men who could be sent anywhere in the nation to settle a score quietly and then slip back into ordinary life. No one knows the true number of people this company took out. The estimates are staggering and range widely, from several hundred to as many as 1,000 over the years it ran. As with the careful crews you heard about earlier, the whole point was to leave nothing behind, so a clean count was never possible. For a long time, the law did not even understand that the operation existed. The cases looked unconnected. Nobody saw the company sitting behind them. One of the most active men in the outfit was Abe Reilly's, a hardened enforcer from Brownsville, known on the street as Kid Twist. He had come up through the rough world of Brooklyn gangs and built a reputation as someone who did the work without hesitation. For years, he was one of the company's most reliable hands. Then, in 1940, everything changed. Reles was arrested, and facing serious trouble, he made a choice almost no one in his world ever made. He decided to talk. He sat down with the Brooklyn district attorney and started telling the whole story, and once he began, he did not stop. His memory was incredible. He laid out job after job in detail, naming names, explaining how the system worked, connecting cases the police had never been able to tie together. His information helped solve dozens of investigations that had sat cold for years. What he knew was enough to bring down some of the biggest names in the operation. Several men were convicted on the strength of his word, and a number of them paid the ultimate penalty under the law. The most important of them was Lepke himself. Lepke became the only top-level mob boss in American history to be put to death by the government for his crimes. And Reles was a major reason why. But Reles knew too much, and that made him the most dangerous man alive to the people he was turning on. His biggest target was still ahead of him. He was being held to testify against Albert Anastasia. If Reles took the stand, Anastasia was finished. That day never came. On a November morning in 1941, Zeles was being kept under heavy police guard on an upper floor of a hotel in Coney Island called the Half Moon. Officers were posted around him day and night. And yet, somehow, Reles ended up outside his window and fell to the ground far below, where he did not survive. There was a knotted bedsheet involved, which led some to say he was trying to climb down and escape. Others believed he was helped out that window by people who wanted him silenced. Possibly even some of the very officers meant to protect him. To this day, no one can say for certain what happened. He earned a dark nickname that stuck, the canary who could sing, but could not fly. With Reles gone, the case against Anastasia fell apart. The one man who could have ended him was no longer around to talk, and Anastasia stayed free for years to come. The reason this story matters so much is what it reveals about the mob at its core. This was not a tale of hot tempers or sudden rage. It was harm organized like a business, with bosses and workers and a steady stream of orders. And the fate of Abe Reles proved something terrifying about that world, that its reach could slip past 18 guards and into a locked hotel room. If the mob could get to a witness there, it could get to anyone. For decades that stayed true. As witnesses vanished, cases fell apart, and the families always seemed a step ahead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the law was about to change the game entirely. The government found a brand new kind of weapon, one that did not depend on a single fragile person staying alive long enough to speak. And it would put the bosses of every major family in the country in the same courtroom at the same time. Section 7. The case that broke the bosses. For half a century, the families ran New York like their own private kingdom, and the law could rarely lay a finger on the men at the top. The reason was simple. A boss almost never did anything with his own hands. He gave an order. Someone far below him carried it out, and there was nothing left to connect the crime back to the man who wanted it done. Catch the soldier, maybe. The boss stayed clean. That was the whole design, and for 50 years it worked. Then came a law that flipped the entire game on its head. It was called RICO, and on paper it sounds dull, but its effect was anything but. RICO let the government go after a criminal group as one single organization. That meant prosecutors no longer had to pin one specific act on one specific man. If they could prove that a person helped run an ongoing criminal operation, they could hold him responsible for the crimes the whole operation committed, even ones he's never personally touched. For the bosses who had spent their lives staying one step removed, this was a nightmare they never saw coming. The law had actually existed since 1970, but for years, nobody quite knew how to use it. It sat on the shelf. Then a sharp federal prosecutor in New York named Rudolph Giuliani saw exactly what it could do. He did not want to put away a few soldiers. He wanted to take apart the entire leadership of the New York mob in one shot. And he had a target in mind that most people did not even believe was real. For decades, there had been whispers about something called the Commission. The idea was that the heads of the major families did not just operate on their own. They sat together as a kind of board of directors for organized crime, settling disputes between families, and signing off on the biggest decisions, including when a boss could be removed. To many outsiders, this sounded like a myth, a story too neat to be true. Giuliani set out to prove it was real and to put the whole board on trial at once. The case came together thanks to years of patient work, especially secret recordings. The FBI had spent a long time listening in on the families, capturing their own voices, arranging deals, and pressuring businesses. One of the family money-making schemes involved controlling the concrete used in big construction projects across the city, squeezing payments out of builders who had no choice but to pay. Those recordings, in the boss's own words, were devastating. The government did not need a nervous witness who might not live to testify. They had the men condemning themselves on tape. In early 1985, Giuliani announced the charges, and the list of names was breathtaking. The heads of several of the 5 families were named, along with other top figures. The charges covered squeezing money from businesses, controlling unions, dealing in product, and ordering people taken out, including a few specific high-profile cases from years earlier. It was the boldest move against organized crime that anyone could remember. The trial began in the fall of 1986. Some of the most powerful criminals in the country sat in a single courtroom and watched the government lay out its case. One of the bosses, a man known as the Snake, was so confident or so stubborn that he chose to act as his own lawyer and argue his case himself. It did not help him. The evidence, especially those recordings, was simply too much to overcome. In November 1986, the verdicts came down, and the convictions were sweeping. The bosses at the heart of the case were found guilty. The punishments, handed down soon after, were crushing. Several of the most powerful men in the American mob, including the bosses of the Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families, were each sentenced to 100 years behind bars. For men already late in life, that was not a sentence, it was the end. What made this case matter so much went beyond the long prison terms. It settled the question once and for all. The commission was not a myth. It was a real, working body, and now it had been proven in open court. The secret structure that had let the families coordinate and protect themselves for 50 years was dragged into the light and put on the record forever. The government had shown it could reach past the soldiers and take down the men who gave the orders, the one thing the mob had always believed was impossible. The families did not vanish overnight. New people stepped into the empty chairs, and organized crime carried on in a weaker form. But something fundamental had changed. The feeling of being untouchable was gone. Younger members could now look at their own bosses and see men who would die in a cell. The risk of that life had always been getting hurt by a rival. Now, the bigger risk was a courtroom, and that fear quietly ate away at the loyalty the whole system depended on. This was the American mob's reckoning, the moment the law finally caught up to the people at the very top. Goodfellas ends with one man hiding in witness protection, looking back on a world that used him up. The commission case was the bigger, truer ending, the slow, grinding defeat of the bosses themselves. But while America was landing this historic blow, something even larger was unfolding across the ocean. In Sicily, the birthplace of the mob, an enormous trial was taking place at the very same time, built around a man who had done the unthinkable. He was a respected boss who chose to break the oldest and most sacred rule of all, and to tell the world everything. Section 8. The man who broke the silence. To understand why this next trial was so enormous, you have to understand the rule it shattered. In Sicily, the home of the original Mafia, there was a code that everyone lived by. You did not talk. Not to the police, not to a judge, not to anyone outside the family. No matter what was done to you or the people you loved. This silence was the thing that kept the whole organization safe. For more than 100 years, it held. Bosses came and went, but nobody at the top ever broke it. Then came a man named Tommaso Buscetta. He was not some low-level soldier. He was a respected, high-ranking figure in the Sicilian Mafia, a man who had lived the life fully and believed in the old ways. By all rights, he should have taken his secrets to the grave. But something happened that pushed him to do the one thing nobody expected. During the 1980s, a brutal power struggle tore through the Sicilian Mafia. One ruthless faction set out to remove everyone who stood in their way, and they did not stop at rivals. They went after families. Buscetta lost a staggering number of his own loved ones to that faction. Sons, a brother, and other relatives taken from him one after another. He was arrested far away in South America and sent back to Italy a broken man. And in his grief and rage, he made his choice. He would talk. The person he chose to talk to was a determined investigator named Giovanni Falcone. Falcone was part of a small of prosecutors in Palermo who had dedicated their lives to going after the Mafia, and he understood something most people did not. To beat this organization, you had to prove it was an organization, a single, connected body with a structure and rules, not just a bunch of separate criminals who happened to be from the same place. Buscetta gave Falcone exactly that. Over many long days, he explained how the whole thing actually worked from the inside. He described the ranks, the bosses, and the secret, ruling council that sat above the families and approved the biggest decisions. He named names and connected the dots between events that had baffled investigators for years. For the first time ever, the police had a map of the Mafia drawn by someone who had lived at its center. Another insider soon followed his lead and began talking too. Armed with this, Falcone and his colleagues built a case unlike anything the world had seen. They did not charge a handful of people. They charged hundreds. And when the trial began in 1986, the sheer size of it was almost hard to believe. 475 people stood accused at once, facing charges that included more than 100 deaths, along with moving product and squeezing money out of businesses. A normal courtroom could never hold a trial like this, so the authorities built one specially for the job. Inside the walls of a prison in Palermo, they constructed a massive, fortress-like hall, strong enough to keep everyone safe and big enough to hold dozens of caged defendants and an army of lawyers, with the world's press watching. People nicknamed it the bunker. It looked less like a court and more like something built to survive a war, which, in a sense, it was. The trial ran for a long time and was a spectacle from start to finish. The most powerful figures of the Sicilian Mafia sat behind bars in that hall, including bosses with fearsome reputations. Some of the very top men were on the run and were tried without being there. And through it all, Buscetta sat and told his story, calm and unshaken, taking apart the myth that the Mafia could never be touched and never be understood. When the first round of verdicts arrived in late 1987, the result was historic. More than 300 people were convicted. 19 of the most important bosses were given life sentences, and the rest were handed prison terms that added up to thousands of years combined. The case went through years of appeals after that, but in the end, the top court in Italy confirmed it. The conviction stood. The reason this trial towers over almost everything else in this story is its scale and what it proved. It was the largest case ever brought against the Mafia anywhere. It established in a court of law that the Sicilian Mafia was one single organization that could be held responsible as a whole. And it did all of this on the back of one man choosing to break a silence that had protected the organization for generations. Buscetta did not just give evidence. He shattered the belief that the code could never be broken. And once that belief cracked, others found the courage to talk as well. It was, by any measure, a triumph. The state had landed the heaviest blow in the history of its fight against the Mafia. But there is a hard truth about this organization that the people celebrating that day understood all too well. The Mafia does not forgive, and it does not forget. It waits. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The two investigators who had built this case and made it stick, Giovanni Falcone and his close friend and partner, had become the most hunted men in Italy. A few years later, the Mafia would take its revenge in a way so shocking and so public that it would shake the entire country to its foundations and change Italy forever. Section 9. The summer the Mafia went to war, the Maxi trial put hundreds of mafiosi away, and the men who ran the Sicilian Mafia took it as a personal insult. The most powerful boss of all, a man called Toto Riina, decided that the people responsible would pay, not the witnesses, not the police on the street. He wanted the two men whose work had made the whole case possible, the prosecutors Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. These two were not just colleagues. They had grown up in the same part of Palermo and had been close friends since they were young. They chose the same dangerous path, devoting their lives to taking the Mafia apart through the law, and they both knew exactly what that choice could cost them. There is a famous photo of the two of them leaning in close, smiling and laughing together. Once you know how their story ends, that simple picture becomes almost unbearable to look at. By 1992, Falcone had become the face of the fight against the Mafia in Italy. That made him the #1 target. On the 23rd of May that year, he was flying home to Palermo with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, who was also a respected member of the legal world. A convoy of armored cars met them at the airport to drive them into the city along the highway. It should have been one of the safest ways to travel. The Mafia had other plans. Working in secret, Riina's men had packed an enormous charge of material into a drainage tunnel running underneath the motorway near a town called Capaci. They had a clear view of the road, and they waited. As Falcone's convoy passed over the exact spot, they set the charge off by remote control. The force was almost beyond belief. It tore a massive crater into the highway and destroyed the cars in an instant. Falcone, his wife, and 3 of the officers guarding them lost their lives. A few people in the convoy survived, but the men the Mafia wanted were gone. The country was stunned. To take out a figure as important as Falcone in such a huge and public way was a message as loud as the Mafia had ever sent. It was not an ordinary act of crime. It was a direct challenge to the entire Italian state, as if to say that no one, no matter how protected, was beyond their reach. And they were not finished. Falcone's closest friend and partner, Paolo Borsellino, was still alive, and he understood immediately what was coming. In the weeks after Capaci, Borsellino lived like a man who knew his days were numbered. He kept working anyway. He had spent his life on this fight and was not going to stop now, even with a target on his back. He even spoke openly about sensing that he had been betrayed by someone he trusted. 57 days after Capaci, on the 19th of July, the Mafia struck again. Borsellino went to visit his mother, who lived on a street in Palermo called Via D'Amelio. Parked along that street was a small car that the Mafia had filled with a hidden charge. As Borsellino walked toward his mother's building, they set it off. He was taken instantly, along with 5 of the police officers assigned to protect him. One of them was a young woman named Emanuela Loi, who became the first female officer in the Italian state police to lose her life in the line of duty. Only one member of the escort survived. 2 of Italy's bravest public servants, best friends since boyhood, had been taken from the country within 2 months of each other. For most nations, a single loss like this would be a defining tragedy. Italy had endured 2 in less than 9 weeks. But the Mafia had badly misjudged what would happen next. Instead of frightening the country into silence, these acts did the opposite. The Italian public was overcome with grief and fury. Ordinary people who had once looked away now demanded action. The state responded with a force it had never shown before. It sent soldiers into the streets of Sicily. It brought in much harsher prison conditions for Mafia members, cutting them off from the outside world so they could no longer run their operations from behind bars. Catching the men behind it all became the top priority in the entire nation. That pressure paid off. Within a year, the great boss Toto Riina, who had ordered all of this, was finally captured after spending decades as a fugitive. The man who thought he could make war on an entire country and win had set in motion his own downfall. In a strange way, by going this far, the Mafia handed the state the one thing it had always lacked: the full anger of the people. The reason this story sits so high on the list is simple. This was not the mob from the movies, hiding in the shadows and settling private scores. This was a criminal organization openly making war on its own government, taking out its judges on public highways and in city streets with the kind of force you would expect from an army, not a crime family. Nothing in the American mob's history comes close to it. It is the clearest proof of just how powerful and how dangerous this organization had truly become. And yet, as monstrous as these acts were, the man who pressed the button on that highway near Capaci had not yet reached the bottom. He was about to carry out an act of revenge so cruel that even other hardened criminals were sickened by it. He would aim it not at a grown rival who could fight back, but at a child. Section 10. The crime that crossed every line. The Mafia liked to tell a story about itself. It claimed to live by a code, a set of rules that supposedly made it more than just a gang of criminals. Men, not women. Enemies, not innocents. And above all, you never touched a child. This was the myth the mob sold to the world and even to itself. The final story on this list is the one that proves that code was always a lie. To understand it, we have to go back to the man from the last section, Giovanni Brusca. He was the one who set off the device that ended Giovanni Falcone, and he was one of the most feared figures in the entire organization, responsible for more deaths than almost anyone. But the act that truly defines him had nothing to do with rival bosses or brave prosecutors. It was aimed at a boy. The story begins with the boy's father, a Mafia member named Santino Di Matteo. He had taken part in the highway plot that ended Falcone, and after he was arrested, he made the same choice Tommaso Buscetta had made before him. He decided to cooperate with the authorities and tell them what he knew. To the Mafia, there was no greater sin, and so they decided to punish him in the cruelest way they could imagine. In late 1993, men working for the Mafia came for his son, a 12-year-old named Giuseppe. They were clever about it. They dressed as police officers and told the boy they were taking him to see his father, who was being kept safe by the authorities far away. Giuseppe trusted them and went along. By the time anyone understood what had really happened, he was gone, hidden away by some of the most dangerous people in the country. What followed is almost too painful to describe. Giuseppe was not held for a day, or a week, or even a month. He was kept hidden for more than 2 years, shifted from place to place, locked away in cramped and miserable conditions, cold and hungry and completely alone. He was a child who had done nothing wrong, paying for a choice his father had made. The men holding him even sent the father pictures of his suffering son, a deliberate message meant to break the man and force him to take back his testimony. Santino was trapped in an impossible position. He loved his son and wanted nothing more than to save him, but the testimony he had given was already part of the legal record. There was no clean way to undo it. He tried to find a path that might bring his boy home safe, and the Mafia kept dangling that hope in front of him while never intending to let go. After more than 700 days, the order finally came from Brusca to end it. The way he gave that order is one of the coldest details in this entire story. He spoke of the child dismissively, as if the boy were not even a person, just a problem to be cleared away. Giuseppe was taken, and then his captors disposed of him in a way designed to make sure nothing would ever be found. They wanted no trace left behind, no proof, nothing for a grieving family to even bury. It is hard to put into words how far this crossed the line, even by the standards of the people who did it. This was not a rival who could fight back. This was not a witness who had chosen the dangerous life. This was an innocent child used as a bargaining chip and then thrown away when he was no longer useful. Mafia members who had spent their lives around terrible acts spoke of this one with disgust. It was widely called one of the most heinous things the organization had ever done. The most important part came next, and it is not what the Mafia expected. They thought this kind of cruelty would protect them by terrifying anyone who might think of cooperating. It did the exact opposite. When ordinary Sicilians learned what had been done to Giuseppe Di Matteo, something inside the public broke for good. Whatever twisted respect or fear had once shielded the Mafia drained away. People who had looked the other way for generations could no longer pretend this was a world of honorable men with rules. Some who lived through it have said that this child did more damage to the Mafia than any army or any court, that in the end, a defenseless boy was the one who truly defeated them. As for Brusca, he was caught a few months after the boy was gone. Years later, he became a cooperating witness himself and gave up huge amounts of information, which eventually led to his sentence being reduced. He walked free after serving 25 years, a decision that caused outrage across Italy, with many feeling that no amount of time could ever balance what he had done. The reason this story closes the list is that it strips away the last bit of the fantasy. The movies give us mobsters with charm, loyalty, and a sense of honor. Men who are dangerous but somehow still admirable. The real Mafia took a child, held him for 2 years, and threw his life away to send a message. There is no charm in that. There is no honor. There is only the truth of what these organizations were always willing to do. This is where the real story of the mob leads, far past the slick suits and the famous one-liners of the films. Everything we have looked at across these 10 cases has been building toward one simple and uncomfortable truth. That truth is what is left to talk about. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.